bankrupt, one not only needs to understand that of how the institutions themselves work, but the musicians need to be prepared not only to be advocates for it, but even so far as to prepare themselves for an alternative career if the worst case scenario should ever happen. Because in my orchestra in Nashville, when we went bankrupt in 1988, or at least they said it was bankrupt, that's another story, many of my colleagues were not prepared. And what we learned in that process, this was an incredible growth situation for us, was that musicians have skills in terms of creativity, discipline, teamwork, which are transferable. And while we all want to make music, it is comforting to know that we could walk out of the symphony orchestra and transfer into so many other fields.
A good point. I think this should be a required course. It should be called The Business of Music.
Absolutely.
Every conservatory student should have to take it. Ideally, I think, you would have one course for instrumentalists, another for singers, another for pianists, and the one for composers could be called Abandon Hope, All Ye Who Enter Here. So the difficulty of making any money doing that. But it seems to me, I'm not going to use fancy words like criminal, but there's something really wrong with people not being taught this when it's such a basic fact of life once they get into the profession.
Well, I think basically awareness. It starts with awareness of our professional industry to say, you know, our people coming in need this training and tools. And through dialogue, I have many good friends who are superb faculty at many leading musical institutions, and they have expressed the same thing to me.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you had said before we sat down to have this conversation formally that there ought to be a summit.
Yes.
Involving the unions, maybe the ASOL, the American Symphony Orchestra League, and the top music schools,
yes,
to talk about what can be done about this. And I think that that's a terrific idea, because as the business changes and outreach becomes crucially more important, when musicians are now asked in many orchestras to get up and speak to donors, to get up at concerts and speak to the audience. I know the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra has formal training in this for their musicians. You really have to be prepared for this even in school. So the earlier, the better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And as the business changes, what kinds of changes do you see happening in the future that we may not even talk about much yet?
Well, I guess I really don't have a crystal ball. I think one of the things that probably we're going to be very much in line with our managements is that our orchestras do need to become more involved and a part of our community. One thing that I'm very excited about, and I'm glad to see gaining foothold in a couple of orchestras, and I hope we'll see this elsewhere. As you may know, Penny Anderson-Brill began the music and wellness program with the Pittsburgh Symphony. One of the orchestras I negotiated with, Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, has begun programs associated with hospitals about bringing music into the ill and terminally ill, and there are definite therapeutic effects. So you bring in that one a special relevance that to music, to the community that may be previously unknown. And not only is this a chance for involvement by the musicians in the institutions in other aspects of the community, but it is potential sources of funding, which is, of course, paramount. I, as a music education major myself, want to see orchestras involved more in training our future concert audiences, because that's where it's at.
And Pittsburgh makes a terrific example here, because the city of Pittsburgh has been losing population for more than a decade, and the Pittsburgh Symphony's ticket sales had been declining for quite a long time, even though when Morris Janssens was the music director, arguably this was the hottest orchestra musically in America. That's subjective, but they were way up there. Way up there. But they were hemorrhaging money. So when Larry Tambouri became the president there, the executive director, the CEO, one of his first priorities was to build bridges to the community, because these bridges were needed. People were not buying tickets, so you really need to make the orchestra known. And so for having musicians who are ready to do this work themselves is a tremendous plus. And Penny, she's such a wonderful spirit. She'd be a perfect person to do it. And I think it also adds to the musicians' lives. I think it makes them fuller as people and fuller as musicians. We talk, about the powerful effect that this music has, and that's one of the reasons it ought to be supported. But when we're doing the kind of work that Penny does, or that Cindy D'Almeida, the principal oboe, does with emphysema and asthma sufferers, it really adds a terrific dimension to your humanity as a musician. Absolutely.
And another factor which musicians don't, I have participated in the concerts of, you may know Roger Nierenberg,
yes,
who goes around the country and does these corporate presentations. And in that, the corporations begin to understand what concepts of teamwork and discipline and communications between orchestra musicians, which they can only hope for in so many corporations that we take for granted. There are things with an orchestra, even in their own community, along those lines and so many lines, that can be done. But all of us need to think a lot more creatively. We know some things that can be done, and there are other possibilities out there too.
This sounds like a logical place to stop, on an up note and with good ideas. Thanks. This was terrific.